Today at 1, after the BBC's Director General Tim Davie and CEO of News Deborah Turness quit, the corporation's chair apologises for an error of judgment in editing a speech by Donald Trump.
We do take it really seriously. I mean, there are real issues here. They're over a 3-year period. And just let me say, the BBC in those 3 years has produced hundreds and hundreds of hours of outstanding journalism.
Well, earlier, the outgoing chief executive of News said the buck stopped with her, but defended the organisation and its journalism.
I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why it's the world's most trusted news provider.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the BBC News at 1. The chair of the BBC, Samir Shah, has apologised for how a Panorama documentary edited a speech by Donald Trump, calling it an error of judgment. It comes after the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, and CEO of News, Deborah Turness, resigned over the issue. Our media and arts correspondent, David Sillitoe, has more.
Monday morning, Broadcasting House and the arrival of the BBC's head of news, an institution she was both saying goodbye to and defending.
I would like to say it has been the privilege of my career to serve as the CEO of BBC News and to work with our brilliant team of journalists. I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased. That's why it's the world's most trusted news provider.
Those accusations of bias began with a story in The Telegraph last week, raising concerns about this Panorama and a clip of a Donald Trump speech.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
That sentence was actually from 2 different sections of Donald Trump's speech, 54 minutes apart. Donald Trump has accused the BBC of being corrupt and dishonest. And yesterday, the head of news and the Director General announced their resignations. In a statement, Tim Davie said, while not being the only reason, the current debate around BBC News has understandably contributed to my decision. Overall, the BBC is delivering well, but there have been some mistakes made, and as Director General, I have to take ultimate responsibility. And now, after days of headlines and 2 major resignations, the BBC chairman has addressed these questions. He said, yes, the edit was wrong, it was misleading, but he denies that those at the top of the BBC have been trying to bury wider accusations of bias. And the chairman today responded to the accusations that have been triggered by a report from a former BBC independent advisor, Michael Prescott.
We have taken action. It ranges from all sorts of things, from issuing corrections when we got it wrong, and to, at the most extreme cases, on cases that Mr. Prescott doesn't talk about, we've issued formally disciplinary measures, to, when it comes to underlying problems, we've made quite a few changes in the leadership of those areas.
And another question is, why is it only now that the BBC is responding?
I'm very sad about Tim Davie stepping down. I think he was an effective leader at the BBC. I think he was a great champion for public service media. But there is no escaping the fact that he was very slow to act on this particular issue.
Tim Davie's watchwords while in charge of the BBC were trust and impartiality, issues that will remain uppermost, whoever replaces him. David Sillitoe, BBC News.
Well, for more on this, we'll be joined by our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, in a moment. First, let's go back to our media correspondent, David Sillitoe. And David, that statement from the BBC chair in the last hour, in it, he apologises for the Panorama mistake, but he's also quite keen to stress and defend the BBC's strength. How will the statement go down?
Yes, a 19-page statement from Michael Prescott, but of course the number one issue in people's minds is that Panorama edit. And Samir Shah says, yes, we accept that the way the speech was edited did give the impression of a direct call for violent action. The BBC would like to apologise for that error of judgment. That is one sentence out of a 4-page document that goes into some detail into what Michael Prescott says essentially is despair at inaction. He was on an editorial committee and he was an independent advisor, and he says a whole series of issues about race, Israel, gender identity, history and historians and BBC Arabic were all raised, and he believes that not enough was done about it. Today, Samir Shah says the whole point of that committee is they did listen to what was being said. They have made changes, for instance, at the top of BBC Arabic, and they've addressed in changes to guidelines and editorial processes. So essentially, a rebuttal not of the Panorama thing, he admits a mistake, but the wider accusation of inaction about these editorial issues.
OK, David, thank you. Let's go to our political correspondent, Nick Eardley, who's in Westminster. And Nick, pressure from all political sides towards the BBC. What's been the latest reaction today?
Yeah, and the politics of this matters more than it might in other circumstances, because in the next few weeks or months, the government will start the process of looking at how to renew the BBC's charter. That's the rules that govern how it works and how it's funded. So the political debate absolutely plays into this. Now, I've just been in Downing Street for a briefing with Number 10 that happens every day, and the Prime Minister's spokesman has said that Keir Starmer does not believe that the BBC is institutionally biased. It doesn't believe that some of its journalists are corrupt, as Donald Trump suggested in his tweet, but does believe that accountability is going to be key for the BBC and that it needs to quickly address mistakes. There's a similar view from the Liberal Democrats. They believe the BBC is a good thing and that losing it would be a problem. But that's not the view of everyone. And the Conservatives and Reform have both said that they think there are problems of institutional bias at the BBC and that there needs to be significant changes to how the corporation works. The Conservative leader, Kemi Badenoch, said that this can't just be swept away with 2 resignations. So what I think is certain is that the political heat on this issue will continue over the next few days, and there will continue to be big questions about what the BBC does next.
Hey, Nick, in Westminster, thank you.
The chair of the BBC has apologised for an error of judgment within the organisation over the editing of a documentary about Donald Trump. Samir Shah's response comes after 2 senior executives at the top of the organisation resigned. Director General Tim Davie and Head of News Deborah Turness both stepped down last night after criticism that the Panorama programme misled viewers by editing a speech made by the US President. This morning, Deborah Turness rejected claims of institutional bias within the company. Yet the resignations have been welcomed by Donald Trump, who has described both Davie and Turness as very dishonest people. Ellie Pitt reports now on a corporation in crisis.
These days, when there are news cameras outside the BBC's headquarters in London, it means there's another scandal. This time it involves the American president and a documentary that has forced the resignation of the broadcaster's top boss and its CEO of news.
I stepped down over the weekend because the buck stops with me. But I'd like to make one thing very clear. BBC News is not institutionally biased.
A Panorama programme about Donald Trump edited together 2 parts of his speech in 2021 that were spoken nearly an hour apart. This is what they used.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
And this is what he actually said.
Right here, we're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
An internal BBC review said Panorama made it look like Trump explicitly encouraged the riots over Joe Biden's election. Trump was cleared in an impeachment trial of inciting insurrection. The US president wrote last night, "The top people in the BBC, including Tim Davie, the boss, are all quitting, fired, because they were caught doctoring my very good, perfect speech of January 6th. Thank you to The Telegraph for exposing these corrupt journalists."
There's been a problem with institutional bias at the BBC for some time, and one of the big issues is a senior management failure to address it. We can see that with the Trump video that was manipulated, because we now know that BBC executives knew about that 6 months ago but chose to do nothing about it. They essentially hid that from the public, presumably hoping that it would never emerge.
This morning, the BBC chair apologised for the video editing, calling it an error of judgment. But the broadcaster's coverage of Gaza and the gender identity debate have also been criticised in the leaked report. Last night, the Director General quit. While not being the only reason, the current debate around BBC News has understandably contributed to my decision. Overall, the BBC is delivering well, but there have been some mistakes made, and as Director General, I have to take ultimate responsibility. Senior bosses going is far from solving the latest crisis. Instead, there are job vacancies and colleagues left to answer the bigger questions about bias at the BBC. Ellie Pitt, ITV News.
Well, let's go to Westminster now and speak to our political reporter, Jasmine Cameron-Chilesi. Jasmine, what has the government had to say about this so far?
So as you'd expect, the reaction to last night's resignations has become increasingly politicised. On the right, Nigel Farage this morning said that the BBC doesn't reflect the country and said without change, millions would stop paying a licence fee. He also said he's spoken to the US president and said Donald Trump's been quite unhappy with how he's been treated by the BBC. Meanwhile, the Lib Dems have written to the Prime Minister this morning, calling on him to condemn the US president's intervention. Now, in the middle of all of this, Downing Street has defended the BBC, arguing that it was not corrupt or institutionally biased, but said it was important to correct mistakes. This really echoes the sentiment and language used by Samir Shah, the BBC chair, who, as we heard, has written to the Culture Select Committee. In his letter, he's apologised for what he's described as an error of judgment surrounding this Panorama documentary, but defended the broadcaster's wider journalism. Now, I think the bigger challenge for ministers is the longer-term future of the organisation. The Royal Charter runs to December 2027, and the Culture Secretary has already started negotiations with the BBC. But what the funding model looks like, particularly in an increasingly fractured political climate and with the growing influence of streaming platforms, is going to be an issue that officials both in the BBC and in the government are going to be grappling with for months to come.
Jasmine in Westminster, thank you.